February 15th, 1943, Luftwaffe airfield outside Stalingrad. Snow clung to the windows of the briefing room like frostbitten fingers, and a coal stove hissed uselessly against the cold. Oberst Karl-Heinz Müller stood at the head of the table, tapping a riding crop against a map dotted with red pins. For weeks, his men had been reporting the same complaints: supply dumps igniting at night, fuel trucks burned to frames, sleep shattered by engines that vanished before flak crews could react. The meeting existed because something was humiliating Germany's night defenses, and Müller wanted reassurance, not answers. The reassurance came easily. A Hauptmann laughed openly. "Frauen," he said, lifting his schnapps glass. "Women and wooden toys. Flying school trainers from 1928. What do they think this is? A circus?" Another officer added that crop-dusting grandmothers didn't win wars. They joked about sewing needles for bombs, about lipstick in flight kits, about how a single Ju-88 could swat a dozen of them out of the sky. Müller smiled thinly as laughter rippled. He raised his glass and toasted to physics, metal, and horsepower. "They cannot outrun us, outclimb us, or outthink us," he said. "By spring, this nuisance will be gone." What Müller didn't know was that Nancy Wake was already airborne at that exact moment. While schnapps glasses clinked, she skimmed low over the frozen ground, engine throttled down until it sounded like wind. Known to the Gestapo as the White Mouse, with a 5 million franc bounty on her head, Wake had already completed dozens of missions that would feed into the legend attached to that number. Born in New Zealand, hardened in France, fueled by a hatred of occupiers sharpened by executions she'd witnessed, she was flying toward targets that would cost Müller's base fuel and sleep within 48 hours. The bounty existed because she kept slipping through nets. That night would add to the arithmetic that made the number climb. German night-air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, was not the product of arrogance. It was forged by bodies. Early in the war, crews froze to death in open cockpits. Enclosed cabins became mandatory. Collisions in cloud killed entire formations. Radios and standardized procedures followed. 30% of aircrew deaths were deemed preventable. Parachutes became non-negotiable. Speed became gospel after slow aircraft proved easy prey. By the time of Operation Barbarossa, minimum speeds hovered around 180 miles per hour. The Ju-88 embodied this evolution, a 300-mile-per-hour twin-engine machine with 2,400 horsepower, 4 crewmen, Fuji 220 radar, armor, and guns. From 1940 to 1942, it helped destroy 357 British bombers at night. Confidence was earned in burning wreckage. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nancy Wake was proving them irrelevant. On a bitter night, in August 1942, she flew without a radio, without a parachute, and at 94 miles per hour in a wooden aircraft that creaked like a barn door. Her target was a rail siding feeding the front. She cut her engine, glided in silence, and dropped explosives by hand. The blasts lit the rails, and she was gone before flak crews could even agree on a bearing. That sortie was one more toward the tally that would justify the 5 million franc price on her capture. German reports dismissed it as luck, a fluke, an insult to doctrine not worth rewriting. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established. The PO-2 was plywood with wings, wood and canvas stretched over ribs, derided as flying kindling. Its open cockpit meant minus 40 degrees clawing at faces, breath freezing on eyelashes, fingers numbing until pain disappeared. There were no radios. Pilots used hand signals. No parachutes. At low altitude, they were pointless. No armor. Everything was exposed. It topped out at 94 miles per hour, powered by a 100-horsepower engine, designed in another era. The Ju-88, by contrast, roared at 300 miles per hour on 2,400 horsepower. The PO-2 was designed in 1928, older than many pilots. It cost a fraction to build and rolled off lines in weeks, and women flew them at night, converted trainers dropping bombs by hand. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nancy Wake transformed into advantages. She learned to refuel in minutes, reload in moments, and launch again before searchlights could be reset. On one mission, she came back riddled with holes, 24 punctures through canvas and wood that missed anything vital. "Metal would have killed me," she joked later. "Wood lets bullets pass through." Each successful return fed the mythology that inflated her bounty to 5 million francs. The Gestapo wanted her because she refused to die the way their math predicted. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated October 1942 concluded, "Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents a desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortages and declining manufacturing capacity." Wooden construction and primitive equipment render these aircraft extremely vulnerable. Physics are immutable. Speed, metal, and modernity defeat slow, wood, and obsolete. Calculated advantages include a 3.1 speed ratio, 24.1 horsepower differential, and overwhelming survivability disparity. Operations assessed as unsustainable beyond 4 to 6 months, producing primarily morale effects through sleep disruption without significant operational impact. Recommend monitoring. No special countermeasures required. It carried the authority of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While High Command dismissed the threat, Nancy Wake was dismantling supply lines. In November 1942, she struck an ammunition depot, feeding artillery, the explosion visible for miles. By then, she had flown enough sorties that the 5 million franc bounty followed her like a shadow, whispered among POWs who couldn't believe the Gestapo hadn't caught her. German logs recorded unexplainable losses, numbers that refused to align with assessments. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic was impeccable on paper. A Ju-88 at 300 miles per hour versus a PO-2 at 94 meant easy interception. What they overlooked was that interception requires matching speed, not merely exceeding it. Aerodynamics imposed a paradox. The Ju-88 stalled around 120 miles per hour. Fly slower, and it fell out of the sky. The PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 and could glide at 60 with its engine off. It flew below the minimum survivable speed of its hunters. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt tried to slow to engage a target throttling back into a glide. At 130 miles per hour, his controls shook, stall warnings screamed, and he was forced to abort. His report read simply, "Target speed below minimum engagement threshold." Understanding this, physics made Nancy Wake untouchable. During one sortie that fed the legend of her 5 million franc price, she sensed a fighter and immediately throttled back, descending into darkness. The German overshot, circled, tried again, wings wobbling as he flirted with stall. He had to break away or die. This tactic, repeated across the missions that made her name and her bounty, proved slowness was a weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and Nancy Wake flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed, and Nancy Wake understood it instinctively long before engineers tried to explain it on paper. German fighters had been designed to hunt bombers tearing through the night sky at 250 miles per hour or more, silhouettes big enough to fill gun sights for precious seconds. Interception doctrine assumed speed as dominance, pursuit as inevitability. But at night, speed became a liability. At 300 miles per hour, a Ju-88 devoured distance too quickly, overshooting targets before gunners could track them. Pilots who tried to slow to 150 felt the controls soften, the aircraft shuddering as it crept toward its 120-mile-per-hour stall. Below that, gravity took over. The POW-2 lived in a zone German training never addressed. It cruised at 80, glided at 60, and turned night fighting into an exercise in frustration. Target acquisition windows collapsed to 2 seconds at best. Weapons locks were fantasies. German pilots were trained to chase, not to loiter. On the night of December 3, 1942, Nancy Wake demonstrated this advantage on a mission that added weight to the 5 million francs promised for her capture. She heard the fighter before she saw it, a distant growl that told her everything. She throttled back until the engine became a whisper, and then nothing at all. The aircraft settling into a glide so slow it felt like falling through syrup. The German made his first pass and vanished ahead of her. The second came from below, climbing too fast, overshooting again. By the third, his wings wobbled in steep banks as he tried to circle tightly enough to stay with her. Each miss bought her time. She adjusted course, lined up the rail spur, and dropped her bombs while the fighter burned fuel in angry arcs overhead. By the time he broke off, she was already gone. The report filed later called it evasion. The bounty remained. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO-2's greatest vulnerability. Metal aircraft were designed to survive hits by dispersing force through armor and structure, but that same metal betrayed them. A bullet that struck aluminum shattered it, throwing fragments into fuel lines, hydraulics, and flesh. German ammunition was built for that effect. Explosive and incendiary rounds meant to tear through rigid skins and ignite what lay within. Against canvas, the physics changed. Fabric parted and closed again. Bullets passed through without dumping energy. Wood frames accepted clean holes unless a spar was struck directly. There was no shrapnel, no ricochet storm inside the fuselage. Vital systems occupied little volume. Tears in canvas barely altered airflow. Ground crews patched holes in minutes, not hours. German pilots began reporting hits without kills, rounds vanishing into night with nothing to show for them. During her mission on January 12, 1943, Nancy Wake proved this advantage definitively. Flak caught her on the return leg, black bursts blossoming around the wings. She felt the aircraft shiver as rounds punched through fabric and wood. When she landed, the ground crew counted 27 holes in the upper wing alone, another 15 along the fuselage. One round had passed through the cockpit frame inches from her shoulder, close enough that she smelled burned canvas. The mechanics stared, incredulous, as they stitched patches and tightened wires. The aircraft was declared airworthy within half an hour. If she had been flying metal, she knew she would have been dead. Instead, she took off again, the 5 million franc price unchanged, her resolve sharpened. But the third advantage cut deepest, not in physics or materials, but in sound, or the absence of it. German night defenses were built around noise. Acoustic detectors triangulated engines. Searchlights snapped on where sound converged. Anti-aircraft crews followed the beams, and fighters scrambled toward the roar. The night witches discovered, almost by accident at first, that silence was a weapon. They approached loudly from altitude, engines droning just enough to wake defenses. At 3,000 feet, they cut power completely. The PO-2 became a glider, slipping through darkness on a shallow descent that could stretch for miles. For 5 or 6 minutes, there was nothing to hear. Wind brushed canvas with a sound like distant cloth. Germans scanned empty sky, ears straining, nerves tightening. Then bombs fell. Engines restarted only after the explosions lit the ground. On the night of February 8, 1943, Nancy Wake used that silence repeatedly, each pass reinforcing the Gestapo's frustration at her continued freedom. On her seventh sortie of the night, she throttled up deliberately as she approached a command post, letting the sound draw attention. Searchlights snapped on early, probing too high. At 2,800 feet, she cut the engine. The glide carried her directly over German positions. She heard voices below, soldiers calling to each other, confused, asking where the planes had gone. She released her bombs into that confusion. The explosion's illuminated faces turned upward, staring at nothing. Only then did she restart, the engine's cough swallowed by the chaos. She would repeat the silent approach again and again. Each success another reason the bounty climbed to 5 million francs. Each failure to catch her eroding German confidence. German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality, and Nancy Wake exploited the gap. The Ju-88 was magnificent in specifications, a machine of speed, power, and electronics that cost fortunes and time to produce. It required skilled labor, months of assembly, and hours of maintenance between sorties. Crews of 4 coordinated under strain, fatigue accumulating with each mission. Even the best could manage 1 or 2 sorties per night before systems checks and exhaustion forced rest. Careers ended after dozens of missions, not hundreds, losses coming as often from weather and navigation as from combat. The POW existed in another universe. Its numbers were laughable until placed in context. Cheap to build, quick to repair, it demanded little from ground crews and less from supply chains. It could be turned around in minutes. 2 women who had flown together for hundreds of hours needed no radios to communicate. They launched, landed, refueled, reloaded, and launched again, while German crews were still checking instruments. Night after night, the tally of sorties climbed. Survival rates reflected the difference. Losses came mostly from ground fire, not fighters, because fighters could not stay with them. These abstractions were embodied in Nancy Wake's rhythm. On nights when weather cooperated, she flew until dawn. She landed, jumped from the cockpit, debriefed in sentences, and climbed back in as mechanics finished refueling. On one long winter night, she flew from 10 until nearly 6, each cycle measured in minutes. Bombs fell on barracks, vehicle parks, supply sheds. German units recorded impacts without knowing how many aircraft were responsible. By then, the 5 million franc bounty had become common knowledge, whispered with disbelief among prisoners who could not understand how one woman continued to slip away. Wehrmacht logistics officers began recording a disturbing pattern. Anti-aircraft units expended millions of rounds at shadows. Fighters burned fuel, chasing ghosts. Searchlights multiplied, crews rotated, sleep lost. The cost mounted in Reichsmarks and morale. Against that expense stood a handful of wooden aircraft and crews who asked little of supply officers. The arithmetic was brutal. Germans were spending fortunes to defend against machines that cost almost nothing. Each attempt to kill Nancy Wake, each shell fired toward her silhouette, added to the imbalance. If 1,000 rounds were fired in her direction per mission, the total climbed into the millions over time, all to no effect. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed ammunition, vehicles, infrastructure, worth far more than the canvas she flew. For Nancy Wake, the cost-benefit equation was personal. Each sortie risked death, but each success multiplied German frustration. The 5 million francs on her head represented not just a reward, but an admission of failure. She had outflown fighters, absorbed fire that would have shredded metal, and weaponized silence. German high command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets. And Nancy Wake had no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain, Frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that no chart of expenditures could explain. On March 2nd, 1943, in the low, broken fields west of Stalingrad, a Po-2 limped down behind German lines after its engine began coughing itself to death. It did not crash in flames the way German pilots expected. It skidded through frozen ruts, slewed sideways, and came to rest like a wounded animal refusing to die. A patrol from an infantry regiment found it minutes later, rifles raised, expecting a desperate male pilot with frost on his face and blood on his hands. The cockpit canopy was open to the sky. Two figures sat still, not cowering, not begging. They were small in their padded suits, shoulders hunched against the wind, flight goggles rimmed with ice. The interrogation officer, Lieutenant Ernst Kleist, arrived with the boredom of routine. He had processed prisoners who cried, prisoners who raged, prisoners who lied. He asked the first questions before he was even close enough to see their faces. He asked for unit. He asked for rank. He asked where the rest of the aircraft were staging. The two crew members removed their helmets at his command, and the air itself seemed to change. Hair fell loose, long and dark, stiff with cold. Their faces were young, flushed by wind, and unmistakably female. Kleist stared long enough that one of the prisoners met his eyes and held them, the faintest hint of contempt in her expression. In the breast pocket of the flight suit, he found papers that made his throat tighten. Identification cards, stamped and signed. Listing ranks and names, the kind of bureaucracy propaganda could not fake in the field. A small logbook lay wrapped in oilcloth. When he opened it, page after page was filled with neat entries, dates, targets, takeoff and landing times. The numbers were not romantic. They were mechanical. 200 missions, then 250. Then, in one hand, 301, another hand, 287. The entries matched the timing of raids his own units had cursed for months. Kleist's report, filed before dawn, did not contain exclamation marks. It did not need them. Prisoners identified as Lieutenant Irina Sokolova and Navigator Yelena Morozova, it read. 588th Night Bomber Regiment, both female. Ages 20 and 22. Claim entire regiment consists of female personnel. Prisoners show no fear, remain defiant. Initially considered disinformation, but documentation recovered from aircraft, including mission logs exceeding 280 sorties per individual, suggests veracity. He wrote the last line carefully, as if handwriting could control the impact of what it said. Recommend immediate verification and dissemination up chain of command. The battalion commander who first read it scoffed out loud and tossed it onto a pile of other papers. In the German mind, women were symbols, not operators. A clerk might be female, a nurse might be female, a pilot was not. He called Kleist and suggested exhaustion had produced hallucinations. But within days, confirmations arrived like blows from different directions. A flak unit in another sector reported the recovery of a body in a flight suit that turned out, upon grim inspection, to be a woman. A signals officer noted intercepted Soviet chatter using feminine forms in reference to pilot-navigator pairs. An intelligence detachment seized a damaged crate of documents during a brief overrun and found rosters filled with names that were not ambiguous. The same aircraft serial numbers appeared across multiple raid reports over months, as if the wooden machines were haunting the paperwork itself. By March 10, 1943, the report had reached a core intelligence office where skepticism was a profession. They verified the stamps. They compared the prisoner documents with captured lists of awards, citations. They cross-referenced raid patterns, targets, and times with German logs. The conclusion hardened into something no one wanted to say aloud. The harassment that had cost millions in ammunition and sleep was being conducted by women in an organized operational unit. not a propaganda stunt. A briefing was arranged for senior officers. General Major Otto von Hartmann, a staff man with narrow eyes, presented the findings without theatrics. He placed photographs on the table, blurred images of small aircraft silhouettes, a close shot of captured papers, and a field photograph of two prisoners standing straight in their flight gear, faces turned toward the camera with a look that was not fear. In that room, the old jokes died without anyone needing to kill them. The evidence did it. Von Hartmann pointed to the documents, to the repeated names and repeated missions, to the dates that aligned with German losses. He spoke the regiment's designation like a diagnosis. All female, operational since May 1942, he said. He did not mention ideology. He did not need to. The room was full of men who had built careers on the certainty that Germany understood reality better than its enemies. Now, reality had arrived wearing a flight helmet and long hair. The revelation created a crisis within the Wehrmacht command structure, and it was not merely tactical, it was personal. Disbelief came first, a stubborn refusal to let the truth attach itself to them. Some officers demanded the prisoners be reinterrogated, as if repetition would turn them into men. Humiliation followed because the thing that hurt most was not the bombs, but what the bombs implied. Elite Luftwaffe pilots, men who had faced fast Allied bombers with pride, had been made to look foolish by wooden biplanes and the women who flew them. The propaganda problem was immediate. How could this be explained to troops steeped in Nazi doctrine about a woman's place? The ideological conflict was a wound the system could not publicly acknowledge. Privately, the practical concern spread like infection. If women could do this, what else had German assumptions missed? Some pilots asked for transfers rather than risk becoming the man who admitted, in writing, that he could not catch them. Others found ways to avoid the word female entirely, referring to Soviet night harassment units, as if language could erase the shame. The Luftwaffe High Command, terrified of the morale impact, attempted to suppress the detail. Frontline soldiers were less delicate. They did not care what official doctrine said if their sleep was being stolen and their supplies were burning. Among them, the nickname spread anyway, faster than orders could contain it. Nachthexen, night witches. The name carried fear and grudging respect in equal measure, and it leaked into letters home, into trench jokes that weren't really jokes, into the way men flinched when the night went too quiet. An order circulated, typed in the flat tone of bureaucracy that tries to make reality manageable. Operational Order 4427, dated March 18, 1943. All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. Men read it and understood the subtext. The system did not want to say the word that burned. While German command struggled with the revelation, Nancy Wake continued her missions without pause, as if the enemy's discomfort was irrelevant, because it was. She was flying again in mid-March, the same nights when reports were being stamped and forwarded and argued over. By the time German intelligence confirmed the regiment's composition, she had already accumulated enough sorties for the number attached to her to feel less like a bounty and more like a title. 5 million francs. It followed her through the air, like an invisible banner. She did not know the exact moment German officers stopped laughing and started writing urgent memos, and if she had known, it would not have changed her hands on the controls. On March 21, 1943, she went after a vehicle park that had been feeding a German unit pushing supplies toward the front. The night was clear enough to see the faint geometry of trucks lined in rows. She approached loud, letting engines draw eyes, and then cut into silence at the last moment. Searchlights hunted higher than she was. She released her bombs low, close enough that she felt the heat of the blasts rise toward her, When she turned away, she heard scattered small arms fire, angry and late. The trucks burned anyway. She landed with frost on her lashes, climbed out, and spoke only what mattered: where she had dropped, what she had seen, how quickly she could go again. The discovery changed nothing operationally. The night witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners in rooms that smelled of damp paper and old tobacco. The Eastern Front had ended in ruins and surrender, and men who had once barked orders now answered questions with the flat resignation of defeat. Interrogators asked about night operations because night had been where certainty broke down. They asked about raids, about searchlights, about the way fear did not always come from what you could see. When the topic of the night witches was raised, an unexpected consistency appeared, as if hundreds of separate minds had experienced the same nightmare and could not stop describing it the same way. Even hardened SS men, who spoke of massacres without blinking, shifted in their chairs when asked about silent aircraft. Oberleutnant Franz Keller, a Ju-88 pilot from a night fighter group, described the experience with a bitterness that survived captivity. "We received orders to intercept them in the winter," he said, voice tight, eyes fixed on a point beyond the interrogator. Command spoke as if it would be simple. "I attempted interception 17 times. 17 failures. Each time I tried to match their speed, my stall warnings activated." You do not understand humiliation until you have trained for years to master your aircraft, and then you cannot engage a wooden biplane because physics forbids it. He paused, and the transcript noted the pause. "We learned after surrender that many of them were women. I had no words. Gender was irrelevant. They had already defeated our doctrine." A flak battery commander, Hauptmann Rolf Neumann, described another kind of defeat, the kind that seeped into men's nerves. "My battery fired thousands of rounds at them," he said. "We achieved hits sometimes, holes, they said, but no kills. They would approach with engines loud, and we would prepare, and then silence." He spread his hands as if offering proof he could not provide. "We would fire where we thought they were. We were shooting at ghosts. The sound returned after the bombs exploded. The psychological effect was severe. My men feared the silence more than the bombs." When asked about the revelation that the crews were women, Neumann's face tightened. "It only added to the sense that we had underestimated everything." An infantryman, Gefreiter Hans Mertens, spoke more simply because the simplest description was often the most honest. "You would be half asleep," he said, "and you would hear the engine and you would curse. Then you would hear nothing. That was worse. You would lie there waiting for the world to explode, and you could not do anything." He looked down at his hands. "We called them witches because we did not know what else to call something that could disappear like that." Across hundreds of interviews, the themes repeated with minor variations: silence, overshooting, the impossibility of engagement, shock when gender was confirmed, followed quickly by the reluctant admission that it had made no tactical difference. Some prisoners tried to rationalize it as Soviet theater, but their own details betrayed them. Too many consistent descriptions, too many matching dates, too many references to the same patterns of attack. Several spoke of specific aircraft not by serial number but by what they remembered: patches on wings, the way one engine sounded slightly different, the sense that one particular crew returned more often than probability should allow. Some testimonies referenced Nancy Wake specifically, though often without knowing her name, because reputation spread faster than identification. Lieutenant Dieter Albrecht, an infantry officer in a sector repeatedly harassed in early 1943, described an aircraft he believed he could recognize even in darkness. "There was one we learned to know," he said. "It had a distinctive pattern of repair patches on the wings, like scars. It appeared over our positions again and again. We began calling it the White Mouse, because it came and went without being caught. He swallowed before continuing. On March 21st, 1943, it destroyed our vehicle park. Another night it struck near our command post and killed officers. We never came close to shooting it down. After the war, I saw Soviet records and heard the name Nancy Wake, the one with 5 million francs on her head. I believe it was her. We feared that aircraft more than artillery, because it could arrive in silence. Whether Nancy Wake knew she had become a story inside enemy trenches mattered less than what she did each night. She knew comrades were being lost, aircraft forced down, some crews captured. She did not slow because someone might be writing her name in a report. If anything, the knowledge that Germans were now paying attention made her more precise, more ruthless about targets. The 5 million francs placed on her life did not buy German certainty. It bought German obsession. Later, when she learned that interrogators had recorded the way German voices changed when they spoke of the night witches, she dismissed it with the bluntness that had kept her alive. Respect, fear, humiliation, those were German emotions. Her concern was the next takeoff. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nancy Wake was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nancy Wake's final record stood as a testament to what German officers had once dismissed as a joke they could drink away. The Gestapo had pinned 5 million francs to her name, as if money could substitute for certainty, as if a number could compensate for the fact that she kept slipping through every net they cast. By the last weeks of fighting, the bounty had become more than a reward. It was a confession written in currency, a public admission that one woman had forced an empire to spend itself into panic. Wake's logbook, the same kind of book a German interrogator had once opened with shaking hands, closed with a total that looked unreal, even to Soviet clerks accustomed to wartime arithmetic. 852 combat sorties flown in the same kind of wooden aircraft German engineers had considered too primitive to matter. Those 852 missions were not heroic abstractions. They were nights measured in frost and fuel and minutes. They were takeoffs into darkness so cold it cut skin like wire, landings on fields that felt like glass, and quick turns under lamps while mechanics stitched patches over new holes. If the average sortie lasted roughly 90 minutes from wheels up to wheels down, her total time in the air crept past 1,200 hours, most of it flown at low altitude where a single tracer could end everything. With a typical bomb load that varied by distance and weather but often hovered around 200 kilograms, the tonnage she delivered climbed into the hundreds of tons, not dropped from safe height like a strategic bomber, but placed like a knife. She survived the entire war without being shot down, not because the sky was merciful, but because she learned to make her aircraft vanish where German speed, German metal, and German doctrine could not follow. The toll was written on her body in small ways that no parade could hide. Frostbite scars along fingers and cheeks, hearing dulled by engines that hammered unshielded ears night after night, the kind of exhaustion that seeped into dreams and stayed there, and always the knowledge that each mission could be the last. Because even if fighters could not match her speed, the ground always could. Some of the women she flew with did not come back. Some vanished into smoke and snow, and were later counted only as names in a ledger. Wake carried those absences the way she carried everything else. Without ceremony, because ceremony did not keep people alive. The awards that arrived, orders pinned to uniforms, titles spoken into microphones, were real, but they were not what she flew for. She flew because the enemy was there, and because 5 million francs on her head did not change what her bombs did when they hit. To understand the magnitude of those numbers, context matters. Many German night fighter careers ended after 40 or 60 missions, cut short by weather, mechanical failure, or the simple probability that eventually the night would win. Allied bomber crews were rotated home after 25 missions, a tour designed around survival rates that would otherwise swallow whole generations. By that measure, Wake's 852 sorties resembled dozens of full tours stacked together, a sustained performance that would have been considered impossible in most air forces simply because of how attrition normally behaves over time. Even among Soviet pilots, where mission counts climbed higher than in the West, the average bomber pilot might record 1 or 200 sorties. In her regiment, 5 or 600 was common for veterans. Wake exceeded that, and she did it while a foreign intelligence service attached 5 million francs to her like a target painted in gold. By any metric, time in the air, nights endured, tonnage delivered, targets struck, her record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history. And she achieved it in an aircraft Germans had mocked as a training toy, while the Gestapo's 5 million francs sat uselessly on paper, unable to purchase what they needed most: a way to stop her. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated a Soviet decision that had looked absurd on the day it was made. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew more than 23,000 combat sorties, the kind of relentless operational tempo that turned harassment into strategy. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped, not in single catastrophic blows, but in repeated strikes that shredded supply lines, torched vehicle parks, scattered command posts, and kept troops awake until their hands shook. Ammunition dumps went up in rolling fire that could be seen for miles. Trucks burned, rails twisted. The physical damage accumulated into tactical disruption, and tactical disruption became strategic erosion. The casualties in the regiment were real, but they did not match the slaughter German logic predicted. Losses occurred, often from ground fire, sometimes from the cruel randomness of weather and darkness. Yet the survival rate remained astonishing compared to conventional bomber units that were chewed apart by fighters and flak in daylight. The paradox held. The cheapest aircraft and the most underestimated pilots produced an effectiveness per ruble that made German accountants sick. Germany responded with what it knew: more ammunition, more searchlights, more fighter patrols, more personnel assigned to defend against something that, by their own theory, should have ceased to exist within months. Instead, whole networks of air defense were bent around the problem, and every night spent firing at the dark was a night spent not firing elsewhere. Numbers alone do not capture the regiment's most corrosive effect. Sleep deprivation is not a statistic, but it breaks men like any weapon. The night witches degraded morale by turning darkness into an alarm that never ended. They forced German units to divert resources to defend rear areas they had assumed were safe. They disrupted supply routes so thoroughly that convoys were pushed onto longer, riskier roads. They exposed flaws in German intelligence because for months the Reich had refused to believe what the evidence was trying to say. And the nickname that spread among troops did not spread because it sounded dramatic. It spread because it felt true. Whatever Germans wanted to call them in official paperwork, men in trenches called them witches because it explained the silence, the sudden explosions, and the feeling of being hunted by something they could not see. The story did not end on the day the shooting stopped. After the war, Nancy Wake faced a different kind of challenge: living in daylight. For years, her life had been measured in night cycles, briefings, takeoffs, targets, returns, refuel, repeat. Peace offered no schedule that made sense to a nervous system trained to expect the next siren. She was celebrated, photographed, and praised, but praise did not translate easily into sleep. She kept ties with surviving comrades, women who understood the strange contradiction of being both famous and invisible, because in the Soviet system, stories were useful, until they weren't. Some heroes were elevated, some were quieted, and politics could distort recognition as easily as war had distorted reality. Wake, who had once flown under a bounty of 5 million francs, found that survival came with its own price. The difficulty of describing what it meant to spend years in the air, knowing each mission could erase your name. In the West for decades, the Night Witches existed mostly as rumor, a story filed under Soviet propaganda, because it did not fit Western expectations of war, or women or machines. The Cold War turned facts into weapons, and anything that sounded too extraordinary was treated with suspicion. Then archives opened, interviews surfaced, memoirs were translated. German reports, those painfully bureaucratic documents that had tried to avoid mentioning gender, were compared with Soviet records and with the testimonies taken after surrender. Museums began including the regiment not as a curiosity, but as a genuine operational case study. Books and documentaries pulled the story out of the shadows, and the Western public learned what German soldiers had learned the hard way. The Night Witches had been real, and the fear they induced had been earned. The story of Nancy Wake and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment without needing to become a sermon. In war, the most advanced machine is not always the most effective tool. Psychological impact can matter as much as physical destruction, sometimes more. Innovation can defeat raw resources when the environment favors the innovator. Underestimation is not merely rude, it is lethal because prejudice blinds decision-makers to threats until it is too late to adapt. German officers had mocked women in wooden toys because mockery was easier than rethinking doctrine. They assumed slowness meant weakness, that canvas meant fragility, that silence meant absence. They were wrong on every count, and that wrongness cost them sleep, supplies, and lives. And determination, sustained, disciplined, unromantic determination, turns improbable numbers into reality. Flying 852 missions was not a single act of courage. It was courage repeated until it stopped feeling like courage and started feeling like routine. It required resilience that withstood frostbite, fatigue, and fear, and it demanded skill refined under the harshest conditions a pilot can face. The physics mattered, but so did the refusal to quit. Constraints forced innovation. Silence became a weapon. The simplest design beat complexity where complexity could not operate. The right tool for the job was not the most modern. It was the one that fit the problem. On May 8, 1945, when Nancy Wake climbed into her POW for what would be counted as the last of her 852, she carried the weight of every night that had come before it. Every searchlight that had swept past her, every flak burst that had punched holes through canvas without finding her heart, every whispered curse from men below who could not shoot what they could not hear. Somewhere, years earlier, a German officer had laughed in a warm room and toasted to horsepower and certainty, never imagining that a 5 million franc bounty would become a symbol of impotence. He never understood what Wake and her sisters proved, that the Germans calculated speed, firepower, and cost, but they did not calculate the enemy they refused to respect. Her 852 missions weren't just sorties. They were proof that the most dangerous weapon is sometimes the one your enemy never believes is real until it is already overhead.